Okay, chapter 11. I had often wondered, oh, and a little brief recap. So a lot happened in the last chapter. Billy, we were told that Billy got a coon cap, so mom made him a hat that with the coon skin, and that made him so excited to go hunting even more. Then when he would go sell his, it was Saturday, all the coon hunters would go sell their coon skins. So that's when Billy would go and he would get to share his stories. He no longer had to sit on the outside to talk. He talked about a big boar that his dogs got, and a big boar coon, and then a little baby coon as well. And he had to also save old Dan from the tree. Okay, so that so far is what happened there. And after he saved him, he went home. He was tired already. I had often wondered, so chapter 11, I had often wondered what old Dan would do if little Ann got into some kind of predicament. One night I got my answer. Okay, so little Ann usually didn't get into much trouble. It was always usually old Dan. So he wanted to know what would happen if little Ann got into some kind of trouble and old Dan had to help her. Okay, so now one night he got his answer. For several days, a northern blizzard had been blowing. It was a bad one. So a blizzard is when it's snowing and there's so much snow going everywhere. The temperature dropped down to 10 below. The storm started with a slow, cold drizzle and then sleet. When the wind started blowing, everything froze, leaving the ground as slick as glass. Oh man, so it was really slippery outside. It was really cold. Trapped indoors, I was as nervous as a fish out of water. I told Mama I guessed it was just going to storm all winter. So why was he nervous? Did he just want to go hunting and he couldn't? That's probably what it was. She laughed and said, I don't think it will, but it does look like it will last for a while. She ruffled up my hair and kissed me between the eyes. This did rile me up. I didn't like to be kissed like that. It seemed that I could practically rub my skin off and still feel it all wet and sticky and kind of burning. That's funny. So he didn't like when his mom gave him a kiss. He said he could rub off his skin, rub off the kiss as many times as he wanted, and could still feel that wet kiss burning his skin. Sometime on the 5th night, the storm blew itself out and it snowed about 3 inches. The next morning, I went out to my doghouse. Scraping the snow away from the two-way door, I stuck my head in. It was as warm as an oven. I got my face washed all over by little Ann. Old Dan's tail thumped out a tune on the wall. So he went to check on his dogs the next morning, and they're nice and warm in their doghouse. I told them to be ready because we were going hunting that night. I knew the old ringtails would be hungry and stirring, for they had been denned up during the storm. So he told them we are going to go hunting today because the ringtails are hungry. So they're going to come out to hunt, to eat, and they've been just just like all of them. They've been kind of just cooped up inside the house, inside their little dens. And now they're going to come out to eat, so we're going to go catch them, is what Billy was saying. That evening, I was leaving the house. As I was leaving the house, Papa said, Billy, be careful tonight. It's slick down under the snow, and it would be easy to twist an ankle or break a leg. Okay, so Papa's worried about him. He's like, it's very slippery down there, so be very careful. I told him I would and that I wasn't going far, just down back of our fields in the bottoms. Well, anyway, he said, be careful. There will be no moon tonight, and you're going to go see some fog next to the river. So he's saying there's no moon. So if there's no moon, then there's less light for Billy to be able to see where he's going and stuff. And there's fog as well, so that makes it even less visible to see. Walking through our fields, I saw my father was right about it being slick and dark. Several times I slipped and sat down. I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of my lantern, but I wasn't worried. My light was a good one, and Mama had insisted that I make 2 little leather pouches to cover the blades of my axe. Okay, so he slipped and fell down several times, but he wasn't worried because he had a really good lantern, and because there were 2 leather pouches covering the blades of his axe. So even though he was carrying an axe, if he fell, he wasn't going to, fall on his axe and cut himself or anything. Just before I reached the timber, old Dan shook the snow from the underbrush with his deep voice. I stopped and listened. He bawled again. The deep bass tones rolled around under the tall sycamores, tore their way out of the thick timber, traveled out over the fields, and slammed up against the foothills. There they seemed to break away and die in the mountains. Okay, so his voice was really, really traveling a lot. Old Dan was working the trail slowly, and I knew why. He would never lie down until little Ann was running by his side. I thought she would never get there. When she did, her beautiful voice made the blood pound in my temples. I felt the excitement of the hunt as it ate its way into my body. Taking a deep breath, I reared back and whooped as loud as I could. Okay, so he's really excited. He's been cooped up inside. He's ready to hunt, and he heard little Ann, and that got him excited for the hunt. The coon ran up river for a way, and then, cutting out of the bottoms, he headed for the mountains. I stood and listened until their voices went out of hearing. Slipping and sliding, I started in the direction I had last heard them. About halfway to the foothills, I heard them coming back. Interesting. So they were going after the coon, and then now they started coming back. Somewhere in the rugged mountains, the coon had turned and headed toward the river. It was about time for him to play out a few tricks, and I was wondering what he would do. I knew it would be hard for him to hide his trail with snow on the ground, and I realized later that the smart old coon knew this too. Okay, so Billy thought, I wonder what this coon's going to be up to, how he's going to try to hide from his dogs. He can't leave track. He can't hide his tracks on the ground because the snow shows the dogs, like if you step on snow, your tracks are going to be there, so the dogs can see that. But Billy said that the smart old coon knew that would show his tracks. So let's see what he did to hide them. As the voices of my dogs grew louder, I could tell that they were coming straight towards me. Once I started to blow out my lantern, thinking that maybe I could see them when they crossed our field, but I didn't realize I didn't stand a chance of seeing the race in the skunk black night. So he started to blow out the lantern, thinking maybe I can see them if I turn this off, and I don't have a bright light shining in my face. But it was too dark. There was no moonlight, so he couldn't see anything. Drawn out of the mountains, they brought him, singing a hound dog song on his heels. The coon must have scented me or scented my lantern. He cut to my right and ran between our house and me. I heard screaming and yelling from my sisters. My father started whooping. So the coon went towards the house, and he heard screaming and yelling from the sisters. And the dad started whooping. I knew my whole family was out on the porch listening to the beautiful voices of my little red hounds. I felt as tall as the tallest sycamore on the riverbank. I yelled as loud as I could. Again, I heard the squealing of my sisters and the shouts of my father. So he felt very proud to have his little hounds, and he thought that they were just so cool. And he thought it was awesome that his family was getting to see him in action. The deep oohs, ooh, of old Dan and the sharp ahs of little Ann bored a hole in the inky black night. The vibrations rolled and quivered in the icy silence. The coon was heading for the river. I could tell my dogs were crowding him, and wondered if he'd make it to the water. I was hoping he wouldn't, for I didn't want to wade the cold water unless I had to do it. So he was wondering, is that coon going to get in the water? Because I don't want to go in the water after him. I figured the smart old coon had a reason for turning and coming back to the river, and wondered what trick he had in mind. I remember something my grandfather had told me. He said never underestimate the cunning of an old river coon. When the nights are dark and the ground is frozen and slick, they can pull some mean tricks on a hound. Sometimes the tricks can be fatal. Ooh, that's scary. Okay, so he's saying that the old river coons, when it's winter time, that's when they can get very, very cunning, and cunning just means very clever. And then they can pull some tricks to get away from the hounds that can actually be fatal for the dog, which means the dog could actually die. I was halfway through the fog-covered bottoms when the voices of my dogs stopped. I stood still, waited, and listened. A cold silence settled over the bottoms. I could hear the snap and crack of sap-frozen limbs. Far back in the flinty hills, the long, lonesome howl of a timber wolf floated down in the silent night. Across the river, I heard a cow moo. I knew the sound was coming from the lowery place. Not being able to hear the voices of my dogs gave me an uncomfortable feeling. I whooped and waited for one of them to bawl. As I stood waiting, I realized something was different in the bottoms. Something was missing. Okay, so something's going on. First they hear, he heard the timber wolf. He heard the cow moo coming from the lower place, and he can't hear the dogs, so he's getting nervous because remember he remembered that what Grandpa said, that it can be fatal, what the coons do. So he's worried about his dogs. He can't hear them. I wasn't worried about my dogs. Oh, okay, so he's not worried about his dogs. I figured that the coon had pulled some trick, and sooner or later they would unravel the trail. But the feeling that something was just not right had me worried. Okay, so he wasn't worried about the dogs. He thought they would be okay, but he still had a weird feeling that something wasn't right. I whooped several times, but still could get no answer. Stumbling, slipping, and slided, I started on. Reaching the river, I saw it was frozen over. I realized what my strange, uneasy feeling was. I had not been able to hear the sound of the water. Okay, so the river was frozen, so he couldn't hear the water, and that just didn't seem right. So he's used to hearing the water, and since he couldn't hear it, he's like, something's weird, something's different tonight. As I stood listening, I heard a gurgling out of the middle of the stream. The river wasn't frozen all the way across. The still eddy waters next to the banks had frozen, but out in the middle where the current was swift, the water was running, leaving a trail in the ice pack. The gurgling sound I had heard was the swift current as it sucked its way through the channel. Okay, so he heard gurgling noises coming from the river, because some of it was frozen, some wasn't. So as the stream is passing by, it's making that noise. The last time I heard my dogs, they were downstream from me. I walked on listening. I hadn't gone far when I heard old Dan. What I heard froze the blood in my veins. He wasn't bawling on a trail or giving the tree bark. It was one long, continuous cry. In his deep voice, there seemed to be a pleading for help. Scared, worried, and with my heart beating like a churn dasher, I started towards the sound. Oh gosh, so old Dan needs help. That's what his bawling is sounding like. I almost passed him, but with another cry, he let me know where he was. He was out in the ice pack. I couldn't see him for the fog. I called to him, and he answered with a low whine. Again, I called his name. This time he came to me. He wasn't the same dog. His tail was between his legs, and his head was bowed down. He stopped about 7 feet from me, sitting down on the ice. He raised his head and howled the most mournful cry I had ever heard. Turning around, he trotted back onto the ice and disappeared in the fog. So he was really upset. Okay, usually he's a very, he's a very strong, tough dog, but this time he was just really just had his head. He had his what did I say? His tail between his legs, and his head was bowed down, and he was just had a mournful cry. I knew something had happened to little Ann. I called her name. She answered with a pleading cry. Although I couldn't see her, I guessed what had happened. The coon had led them to the river. Running out on the ice, he had leaped across the trail. My dogs, hot on the trail, had followed. Old Dan, a more powerful dog than little Ann, had made his leap. Little Ann had not made it. Her small feet had probably slipped on the slick ice, and she had fallen into the icy waters. Old Dan, seeing the fate of his little friend, had quit the chase and come back to help her. The smart old coon had pulled this trick, and a deadly one it was. Oh no. So little Ann fell into those really ice-cold waters, because as the ice was running out on the lake, on the river, then old Dan just made a jump for it and made it to the banks, to the river banks, but little Ann was too small, and she couldn't jump far enough to make it. I had to do something. She would never be able to get out by herself. It was only a matter of time until her body would be paralyzed by the freezing water. She would die. She would get hypothermia and die. Laying my axe down, I held my lantern out in front of me and stepped out on the ice. It started cracking and popping. I jumped back to the bank. Although it was thick enough to hold the light weight of my dogs, it would never hold me. Little Ann started whining and begging for help. I went all to pieces and started crying. Something had to be done, and done quickly, or my little dog was lost. I thought of running home for a rope or for my father, but I knew she couldn't last until I got back. I was desperate. It was impossible for me to swim to the freezing water. I wouldn't last for a minute. She cried again, begging for the one thing I couldn't give her, help. Poor little Ann. So she's in there, she's just crying and begging for help. And Billy is just trying to figure out, what could I do? He's like, I could go back and grab a rope and stuff, but he knew that if he did that, by the time he came back, she would probably already be drowned. She would probably already drown. I thought if only I could see her, maybe I could figure out some way I could help. Looking at my lantern gave me an idea. I ran up to the bank about 30 feet, turned and looked back. I could see the light, not well, but enough for what I had in mind. I grabbed my lantern and axe and ran for the bottoms. Okay, so he grabbed his lantern, his axe. He had some plan that he was going to go and he tried to do, and he ran for the bottoms. I was looking for a stand of wild cane. After what seemed like ages, I found it. With the longest one I could find, I hurried back. After it was trimmed and the limber end cut off, I hung the lantern by the handle on the end of it and started easing it out on the ice. Okay, so what he did was he grabbed the stand of a wild cane, okay, like that, and then he just took his lantern and put it on the end. That way when he's walking like this, then the light is in front of him and he can see further down how thick the ice is, and if there is any ice, so that way he doesn't fall into the water. I saw old Dan first. He was sitting close to the edge of the trough looking down. Then I saw her. I groaned at her plight. All I could see was her head and her small front paws. Her claws were spread out and digging into the ice. She knew if she ever lost that hold, she was gone. Old Dan raised his head and howled. Hound though he was, he knew it was the end of the trail for his little pal. I wanted to get my light as close to little Ann as I could, but my pole was a good 8 feet short. Setting the lantern down, I eased the pole from under the handle. I thought, I'm no better off than I was before. In fact, I'm worse off. Now I can see when the end comes. Oh no, he's like, I don't know what to do. I still can't get to her. So now it's even worse because now I'm going to see her die. Little Ann cried again. I saw her claws slip on the ice. Her body settled lower in the water. Old Dan howled and started fidgeting. He knew the end was close. Oh no. I didn't exactly know when I started out towards my dog. I had taken only 2 steps when the ice broke. I twisted my body and fell toward the bank. Just as my hand closed on a root, I thought my feet touched bottom, but I wasn't sure. As I pulled myself out, I felt the numbing cold creep over my legs. Oh gosh. So he fell in the water, but he pulled himself out. It looked so hopeless. There didn't seem to be any way I could save her. At the edge of the water stood a large sycamore. I got behind it, anything to blot out that heartbreaking scene. Little Ann, thinking I had deserted her, started crying. I couldn't stand it. I opened my mouth to call old Dan. I wanted to tell him to come on and we'd get home. As there was nothing we could do, the words just wouldn't come out. I couldn't utter a sound. I lay my face against the icy cold bark of the sycamore. I thought of the prayer I had said when I asked God to help me get 2 hound pups. I knelt down and sobbed out a prayer. I asked for a miracle which would save the life of my little dog. I promised all the things that a young boy could if only he would help me. So he's just praying to God, and he just doesn't know what to do. He thinks little Ann's just going to die. Still saying my prayer and making promises, I heard a sharp metallic sound. I jumped up and stepped away from the tree. I was sure the noise I heard was made by a rattling chain on the front end of a boat. I shouted as loud as I could, "Over here, I need help. My dog is drowning." I waited for an answer. All I could hear were the cries of little Ann. Again I hollered, "Over here, over to the bank. Can you see my light? I need help. Please hurry." I held my breath waiting for an answering shout. I shivered from the freezing cold of my wet shoes and overalls. A straining silence settled over the river. A feathery rustle swished by in the blackness. A flock of low-flying ducks had been disturbed by my loud shouts. I strained my ears for some sound. Now and then I could hear the lapping slap of the ice-cold water as it swirled its way through the trough. So, he heard a boat and he wants them to come and help him and save his little Ann. I glanced to little Ann. She was still holding on, but I saw her paws were almost at the edge. I knew her time was short. I couldn't figure out what I had heard. The sound was made by metal striking metal, but what was it? What could have caused it? I looked at my axe. It couldn't have made the sound as it was too close to me. The noise had come from out in the river. When I looked at my lantern, I knew it had made the strange sound. I had left the handle standing straight up when I had taken the pole away. Now it was down. For some unknown reason, the stiff wire handle had twisted in the sockets and dropped. As it had fallen, it had struck the metal frame, making the sharp metallic sound I had heard. So what he heard was his lantern falling. As I stared in at the yellow glow of my light, the last bit of hope faded away. I closed my eyes, intending to pray again for the help I so desperately needed. Then, like a blinding red flash, the message of the lantern bored its way into my brain. There was my miracle. There was my way to save my little dog. And the metallic sound I had heard were my instructions. They were so plain I couldn't help but understand them. The bright yellow flame started flickering and dancing. It seemed to be saying, "Hurry, you know what to do." So he said that the lantern falling actually was telling him what to do. Faster than I had ever moved in my life, I went to work. With a stick, I measured the water in the hole where my feet had broken through the ice. I was right. My foot had touched the bottom. 18 inches down, I felt the soft mud. With my pole, I fished the lantern back to the bank. I took the handle off, straightened it out, and bent a hook in one end. With one of my shoelaces, I tied the wire to the end of the cane pole. I left the hook sticking out about 6 inches beyond the end of it. So he's getting his pole, he's getting his lantern, he's getting his shoelaces to tie the wire to some wire to the end of the cane pole. I started shouting encouragement to little Ann. I told her to hang on and not give up, for I was going to save her. She answered with a low cry. With the hook stuck in one of the ventilating holes in the top of my light, I lifted it back out of the ice and set it down. After a little wiggling and pushing, I worked the hook loose and laid the pole down. I took off my clothes, picked up my axe, and stepped down into the hole in the icy water. It came to my knees. Step by step, breaking the ice with my axe, I waded out. The water came up to my hips and then to my waist. The cold bite of it took my breath away. I felt my body grow numb. I couldn't feel my feet at all, but I knew they were moving. When the water reached my armpits, I stopped and worked my pole towards little Ann. Stretching my arms as far as I could, I saw I was still a foot short. Closing my eyes and gritting my teeth, I moved on. The water reached my chin. Oh man, this is really cold water. And he took off his clothes, which is really smart, because if you take off your clothes, if you have this kind of emergency situation, you have to get into some really ice cold water, and you take off your clothes, then it doesn't get wet. So then when you're when you get out of the water, you can come back and put your dry clothes on and warm up. The water reached my chin. I was close enough. I started hooking at the collar of little Ann. Time after time, I felt the hook almost catch. I saw I was fishing at a wrong angle. She had settled so low in the water I couldn't reach her collar. Raising my arms above my head so the pole would be on a slant, I kept hooking and praying. The seconds ticked by. I strained for one more inch. The muscles in my arms grew numb from the weight of the pole. Oh my gosh, he's just in there getting hypothermia as well. Little Ann's claws slipped again. I thought she was gone. At the very edge of the ice, she caught again. All I could see now were her small red paws and her nose and eyes. By old Dan's actions, I could tell he understood and wanted to help. He ran over close to my pole and started digging at the ice. I whipped him with the cane. That was the only time in my life I ever hit my dog. Yeah, because then he wanted to try and help, but he's not helping. He's making things worse. He needs to stay and wait. I had to get him out of the way so I could see what I was doing. Just when I thought my task was impossible, I felt the hook slide under the tough leather. It was none too soon. As gently as I could, I dragged her over the rim of the ice. At first I thought she was dead. She didn't move. Old Dan started whining and licking her face and ears. She moved her head. I started talking to her. She made an effort to stand but couldn't. Her muscles were paralyzed and the blood had long ceased to flow. Okay, so she was really like she was already really frozen. So she was just barely alive. But Billy did save her. At the movement of little Ann, old Dan threw a fit. He started barking and jumping. His long red tail fanned the air. Still holding on to my pole, I tried to take a step backward. My feet wouldn't move. A cold, gripping fear came over me. I thought my legs were frozen. I made another effort to lift my leg. It moved. I realized my feet were stuck in the soft, muddy bottom. Okay, he thought his legs were frozen and he couldn't move and he was stuck there. But it was just the mud. His feet were just stuck to the mud. I started backing out, dragging the body of my little dog. I couldn't feel the pole in my hands. When my feet touched the icy bank, I couldn't feel that either. All the feeling in my body was gone. I wrapped little Ann in my coat and hurried into my clothes. With the pull, I fished my light back. So he got little Anne, wrapped her in his coat, put his clothes back on, and got his light back with the hole so he can go back home. Close by was a large drift. I climbed up on top of it and dug a hole down through the ice and snow until I reached the dry limbs. I poured half of the oil in my lantern down into the hole and dropped in a match. In no time I had a roaring fire. I laid little Anne close to the warm heat and went to work. Old Dan washed her head with his warm red tongue while I massaged and rubbed her body. I could tell by her cries when the blood started circulating. Little by little her strength came back. I stood her on her feet and started walking her. She was weak and wobbly, but I knew she would live. I felt much better and breathed a sigh of relief. So he got his, because these lanterns used to use oil, so with the oil, Billy was able to make a fire, and that warmed little Anne back, warmed her body back, and then she was able to start getting strong again. After drying myself out the best I could, I took the lantern handle from the pole, bent it back to its original position, and put it back on the lantern. Holding the light out in front of me, I looked at it. The bright metal gleamed in the firelight glow. So, I don't know how the lantern helped him, how he said it was telling him the instructions, but he was looking at it. I started talking to it. I said, "Thanks, old lantern. More than you'll ever know. I'll always take care of you. Your globe will always be clean, and there'll never be any rust or dirt on your frame." He was so thankful for the lantern. I knew if it had not been for the miracle of the lantern, my little dog would have met her death on that night. Her grave would have been the cold, icy waters of the Illinois River. Out in the river, I could hear the cold water gurgling in the icy trough. It seemed to be angry. It hissed and growled as it tore its way through the channel. I shuddered to think of what could have happened. Before I left for home, I walked back to the sycamore tree. Once again, I said a prayer, but this time the words were different. I didn't ask for a miracle. In every way a young boy could, I said thanks. My second prayer wasn't said with just words. All my heart and soul was in it. So he was so grateful to God for saving his little dog. On my way home, I decided not to say anything to my mother and father about little Anne's accident. I knew it would scare Mama, and she might stop my hunting. So he kept all of that to himself. Reaching our house, I didn't hang the lantern in its usual place. I took it to my room and set it in a corner with the handle standing up. He just wanted to take more care of the lantern because he just thought, wow, this lantern really saved my dog. The next morning, I started sneezing, came down with a terrible cold. I told Mama I had got my feet wet. She scolded me a little and started doctoring me. Doctoring means just taking care of him. For 3 days and nights, I stayed home. All this time, I kept checking the handle of my lantern. My sister shook the house from the roof to the floor with their playing and romping, but the handle never did fall. I went to my mother and asked her if God answered prayers every time one was asked. She smiled and said, "No, Billy, not every time. He only answers the ones that are said from the heart. You have to be sincere and believe in him." She wanted to know why I asked. I said, "Oh, I just wondered and wanted to know." She came over and straightened my suspenders, saying, "That was a very nice question for my little Daniel Boone to ask." Bending over, she started kissing me. I finally squirmed away from her, feeling as wet as a dirt dauber's nest. My mother could never kiss me like a fellow should be kissed. He thought Mom was always too slobbery, kissing him and leaving slobber on him. But he said he wanted to know if God always answered prayers, because it seemed like he was always answering Billy's prayers. Before she was done, I was kissed all over. It always made me feel silly and baby-like. I tried to tell her that a coon hunter wasn't supposed to be kissed that way, but Mama never could understand things like that. I stomped out of the house to see how my dogs were. And that's the end of chapter 11.